Okay, so surely I wasn't the only one who saw the head of the living tribunal in Loki episode number 5. There's no possible way I was the only one. And I'm not so arrogant as to believe that I was. That'd just be a real crappy thing to do. So, the head of the living tribunal, among a bunch of other things we got over the course of the episode, this was amazing. Episode number 5 was awesome. The head of the living tribunal, which we'll talk about here in a second because that's probably the single biggest thing to come out of the episode. The Thanos copter, which is really, really cool. Fun fact here. So back in the day in Marvel Comics, Spider-Man, of course, as you guys know, has been a face of the company for a long, long time. But in order to make comics more accessible to little kids, Marvel released a Spider-Man-centric line of comics called Spidey Super Stories. And these basically focused on Spider-Man from like a kid's perspective, right? Just writing it in a more toned down, fun, oftentimes goofy sort of thing. And there was a point where Thanos came to Earth in pursuit of the Cosmic Cube, got it for a brief second, but during that time, he was piloting what was called the Thanos copter. That's the same story you've probably heard of where Thanos gets arrested by the cops in the end. That story was kind of silly, but it was also really, really funny. I don't think we ever covered it on Comics Explained, and if we didn't, then we probably should. But we also got the helmet of Darren Cross from the first Ant-Man movie, of course, him looking like a giant man, so presumably that wasn't supposed to happen. But we got a lot of cool little tidbits here, and a lot of the things that we saw were not necessarily things that were of any real major significance. Some of the things that we saw included stuff like Thanos' ship Sanctuary. We saw a SHIELD helicarrier, little things along those lines, right? Small little things that kind of popped up here and there, which is a cool little sight to see. But the head of the Living Tribunal is probably the biggest thing to come out, and here's the reason why. When the Living Tribunal was first referenced in Doctor Strange 1 with the staff of the Living Tribunal, it was easy to chalk it up and say, okay, cool, it's just a little Easter egg, right? They named their staff after a really powerful character. To see the head of his character, even if it's only in a statue form, that's big, right? Because what it means is there are other beings out there that recognize the validity of the Living Tribunal. When one society recognizes something, it's possible they made it up. When a second society recognizes the same thing, it's because they existed. And that's the way it works with the Living Tribunal. So why does this matter that the Living Tribunal's head appeared in Loki? Well, outside of the fact that we know he was real, we know that seemingly somewhere along the line, either he continues to exist or he was destroyed. It's kind of wild. The Living Tribunal is basically the walking, talking embodiment of the multiverse. But more so than that, the Living Tribunal was the result of a mistake that was made by the One Above All. So a little bit of history here. Originally, the One Above All created what was called the first firmament, or the first universe. And basically, it was a singular universe that was essentially sentient. Now, the whole idea behind this was that the first universe got lonely, so it created life in the form of beings called aspirants. And the aspirants were wholly faithful to the first universe in the sense that when they created planets, they created solar systems and galaxies, stars, all that kind of stuff, life on different worlds, they would approach the first universe to seek its approval. And if the first universe approved, they would continue on. If it disapproved, they would destroy it and start over again. Some of these aspirants defected. And the reason why was because they believed the first universe should learn to understand change and growth and mortality, and that the universe itself should die and then be reborn, and then basically grow from its previous death into its new death and kind of expand onward from there. These ones who defected started calling themselves the Celestials. And this led to what was effectively a holy war between the aspirants and the Celestials. And this led to the Celestials basically taking that opportunity to defeat the aspirants and then destroying the first universe in the process. Technically, the death of the first universe was a byproduct. It shattered into an infinite number of pieces, and that's where you got the first multiverse from. But the thing about this is that the Living Tribunal was created because the One Above All realized its mistake with the first universe. It didn't need a sentient universe to govern everything. It needed a non-partial judge to basically overlook everything. And so the Living Tribunal was created to kind of maintain different laws. Now, how those laws have been invoked over the years have kind of changed to a degree, right? Sometimes it's maintaining magical balance, hence the first reason why he appeared when Zom showed up. Zom was basically a villain that was way more powerful than Dormammu, and it took the Living Tribunal defeating Zom to basically help Doctor Strange save the day. But you also saw the Living Tribunal fulfilling other roles across Marvel. So it's not really a consistent thing, just kind of bounces around from place to place. But the important thing here is that the Living Tribunal is the judge of the multiverse, basically making sure that the multiverse stays in its form, that it stays organized and structured. The fact that the TVA is doing what it's doing right now and the Living Tribunal is not intervening means only one of two possibilities. Either what the TVA is doing is supposed to happen, it's the natural order of things, or the Living Tribunal is dead. I'm inclined to believe the latter of the two, because according to Sylvie and everything that we've seen over the course of the show, the natural state of the multiverse is to be a place of chaos, where universes are being born and destroyed and all that kind of stuff over and over and over again. And even the multiversal cycle cycle, right? That the multiverse itself will be destroyed and then reborn at a future point in time. It's just the natural order of things. So normally under those circumstances, you would expect the tribunal to step in, basically wipe the TVA out of existence and then call it a day. But doesn't seem to be the case. But again, looking at this episode, there's a really, really cool thing that I noticed here. So if you go and you look at the trailer for the very, very first episode, or really the trailer for the show as a whole, there's this scene, really a couple scenes, but there's this scene where Loki is sitting on like this gigantic throne. Now the scene that we get is basically him standing up and then walking towards the camera, which is most likely walking towards Loki himself, right? The Marvel Cinematic Universe version of Loki. And I say that because in the following scene, you have Loki from the MCU who's wearing the exact same outfit he was wearing at the end of episode number 5. So seemingly it's when they enter the castle, but he's only walking by himself. And so there's only a couple things here. Either he and Sylvie split up, which really seems to make sense, or Sylvie was destroyed somewhere along the line. I don't know if that's really the case. Regardless of the situation, this giant castle that they're in at the end of episode number 5, this is pretty wonky, man, because you can take it in a couple different ways. One, you could consider it being Castle Kang, but we haven't really seen Castle Kang that many times in Marvel. Instead, what you actually end up seeing in its stead is basically the Castle of Immortus, a place called Tenebrae, and it actually exists in a land called Chronopolis, which is essentially a place in limbo. Technically, it's not really a part of any of the time streams. So in Marvel Comics, a quick explanation here, you got limbo in a couple different forms. You have limbo from like the character of Magic, Ileana Rasputin, which is basically like this almost hellscape dimension, and then you've got true limbo, which is a place that exists outside of time and space, and that's usually where Immortus resides. The idea of him being there is to be able to manipulate and really look after the whole time stream and change things as he wants to. We'll talk about why that matters here in a second. But basically, the look of the castle is not really the look of Tenebrae. It looks like Castle Doom. And so there's a lot of theories going around that it's Victor Von Doom who resides inside this castle. I don't think it is. I don't think that's actually what's going on. I think it's just the castle of possibly Kang the Conqueror or Immortus or whoever. But basically, the occupant inside that castle is a future variant of Loki, or some variant of Loki, who looks like the Allfather. In that particular scene that we saw, he looks like the Allfather. He looks like in his reality, or possibly just took on some suit of armor or whatever. Maybe he killed Odin in his own universe and Thor, and then just became the rightful ruler of Asgard. We don't really know how we get from point A to point B. We haven't even really seen him yet. We haven't really seen that scene yet. So I have no idea if this is accurate or not, but that's just kind of my feeling there. But the reason why I think that version, that this is Loki inhabiting this castle and Loki is operating under the moniker of Immortus, is because it fits into what Loki would do, right? Remember earlier in the series, one of the things that Owen Wilson said is that Loki stabs everybody in the back, right? He always stabs people in the back. And that's one of the things to notice over the course of the show. And that's the reason why the variant Lokis are so important. Over the course of the show, Sylvie was seemingly just kind of doing her own thing, right? She would cross whoever she needed to cross. The mission was the only important thing. It wasn't until she encountered the main cinematic universe version of Loki that she started to turn over a new leaf and started to become what we would call a traditional good guy. The same thing for the variant Lokis, right? Like they were cutthroat. They were just, I mean, I guess they saved Loki, but it's one of them, right? So he's like, we survived. So I guess it makes sense they would save themselves. But regardless, like even then they were like, you can go and do your own thing if you want to, like whatever, man. We're not going to worry about you. You see all the variant, like vote Loki and all that kind of stuff. They're all literally mired in betrayal, right? That's the whole thing about Loki. They always betray each other. Now, the reason why this matters is because in Marvel Comics, the origin of Immortus is that he was a version of Kang the Conqueror, and that version of Kang had grown tired of being in battle all the time, right? Like constantly trying to conquer the time stream, defeat the timekeepers, failing over and over and over and over again. And so ultimately he was offered a deal by the timekeepers to basically be the one that would help ensure that their future comes into existence, whereby the timekeepers exist instead of their evil alter counterparts, the time twisters. And so Immortus was given like this 70 century long period of time, right? Basically ruling from 3000 BC to 4000 AD, and then just kind of monitoring the time stream and sometimes fulfilling the charter of the timekeepers, other times fulfilling his own goal and his ambitions. Now, let's kind of apply this to the character of Loki. Let's replace the idea of him trying to face the timekeepers and defeat them over and over and over again. Let's replace that with like trying to conquer Asgard. Or let's replace that with trying to conquer a universe, or whatever the case is. Whatever his grand purpose is, right? His glorious purpose, constantly failing to achieve that purpose. And so let's say he's snatched up by the TVA, he's brought into the timekeepers, and the timekeepers are like, actually, you can work for us. You can fulfill your glorious purpose by working for us, right? That'll be the role that you play. And then Loki, being the great betrayer that he is, killed the timekeepers, right? Like, destroyed them, and then in turn took over. It may be that it has nothing to do with the multiversal war, that he didn't start it, he wasn't the one who fought in it, he just capitalized on the aftermath of it, right? The fact that like the timekeepers had really created a sacred timeline, and they were trying to keep alternate realities from coming into existence. And this was an alternate reality version of Loki who was supremely adept at manipulation, and then took out the timekeepers, and then basically now rules at the end of time, and just kind of allows the timekeepers to do their thing. And maybe one of these things where he's always trying to make sure that all the Lokis end up becoming like him. I don't really know. Whatever the case is, I think that's Loki, right? I think the person inside that giant castle is Loki. I think that may be some alternate reality version of him or his future self, right? Like the person that Richard E. Grant will ultimately become. One of the other things that we got to see here was Alioth. And I'll be honest with you guys, I never in my life ever thought that I would see Alioth appearing in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Never in my life did I ever think I would see that. It makes sense, right? Because Alioth is tied directly to Kang, and if ever we were gonna see Alioth, we would see it in the Loki series. So here's the thing about how Alioth and all this stuff works, right? So in previous videos, we've talked about temporal empires, and I tell people the easiest way to understand this is to look at the past of the Earth itself, where you had like the British Empire and the Spanish Empire and the French Empire, and how they would go to war with each other. Imagine that on a multiversal scale. And you basically have the Empire of the TVA, for lack of a better word. Then you have the Empire of Kang, and then you have the Empire of Alioth, different things like that. So Alioth was basically the first being to break away from a linear progression throughout the timeline, which is to say being born, living some number of years, and then dying. And then in doing that, basically managed to find a way to kind of permeate the entirety of the timeline and actually create branching off universes. What this means is that the multiversal empire of Alioth is colossal, about 3 times as big as Kang's. And in fact, Alioth is so immense in terms of its form and function, the fact that anything that goes into it basically gets absorbed and dies, that Kang actually doesn't want to have anything to do with Alioth. And in fact, Kang avoids Alioth, right? So think of Alioth as like the south side of Chicago. It's basically what it is. But the whole point here is that Alioth is a force to be reckoned with. Now, seeing the depiction in the Loki TV show as what's basically a guard dog at the edge of time is interesting. Honestly, I'm not so partial to Alioth that I'm upset about it. Doesn't really matter to me. It's kind of intriguing, but at the very least, it's a cool thing to see this wildly obscure character that's appeared maybe 15 times over the course of Marvel Comics being thrown into the Loki TV series, because again, it really all points the finger towards Kang. Now, speaking of Kang, and really more Immortus than Kang, here's the theory that we have. Now, I like the idea of this version of Loki basically being Immortus because it tidies everything up, right? Time travel is confusing enough. I mean, look at how many people were confused and baffled by the events of Avengers Endgame, right? For the most part, people who are watching these shows and these movies are not people who are well-versed in how this stuff works in comics. They're soccer moms and hockey dads, right? They're just sitting down and watching this because it just looks interesting. And you have to cater to that audience. And so I think bringing in Immortus as some version of Kang, a character that we haven't seen yet, and then through a whole slew of time travel escapades, they all kind of end up becoming more or less the same person, but they're not really the same person. They're a little bit different because they exist at different points in time. That'll confuse the hell out of people. I think a far simpler approach to this is to say this variant version of Loki is basically going by the moniker of Immortus, just operating under the name of Immortus. Now, maybe it got it from Kang because that's the name that Kang used at one point over his lifespan, but the reality is invoking someone like Kang from the Marvel Comics landscape, kind of adapting it as a one-to-one, would confuse the hell out of people. It confuses me at times, and I've been reading comics for 25 years, so like, imagine what it's gonna do to the average person. Kang is a tough nut to crack, so I think separating Immortus from Kang is probably the best decision that Marvel could make here. I don't know, it's interesting, man. I love this. This is the crazy thing. We're 5 episodes into this show, and I still don't fully know exactly how things are gonna play out. Usually you know by the time you get to this point, right? Usually you know how things are gonna play out. It's the same thing with WandaVision, right? By the time you got to like the 8th episode, you were like, okay, so we pretty much know how this series is gonna end, right? We know how things are gonna unfold. She'll become the Scarlet Witch. She'll take off into the multiverse in order to probably save her kid's life. Like, I mean, you kind of knew what direction things were gonna go in. In this, I have no idea, man. I have no earthly clue. The one big takeaway that I think is gonna happen from this is that if we go with the idea that the TVA really is fulfilling its role, which it looks like it is because of the Void, that they're actually pruning the timeline of things that aren't supposed to be there and keeping the timeline on the straight and narrow, that the TVA will be destroyed at the end of the series. And with nobody keeping the timeline in check, it'll descend into absolute chaos. And so while that will lead into Doctor Strange 2 Multiverse of Madness, and I don't think it's the definitive reason why the Multiverse of Madness is happening, I think it's one of of the reasons why it's happening, right? I think the idea, the plot of Doctor Strange 2 and the Multiverse of Madness taking place is just a bunch of things happening all at the same time, right? Like multiversal imbalance, all just kind of happening at the same time, right? Like the inmates are running the asylum is essentially what it would be. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section. I've rambled enough. Anyway, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.